Welcome. You have found your way to this quiet moment, and that is enough. Take a breath. Let the day's noise settle. Whatever filled your hours, the movement, the decisions, the small urgencies, you can set all of it down now. There's nothing left to do tonight. Tonight we are going to follow a family through the long winter months of rural America in the 19th century. They lived in a log cabin on the frontier, a small structure of hewn timber standing in open country, surrounded by snow and cold and the vast silence of the season. Their world was shaped by one single concern above all others: staying warm through the night. This is not a story of hardship for its own sake. It is a story of knowledge, of how people learned over generations to read the cold, to work with the materials around them, and to build a life that moved in careful rhythm with the seasons. The routines they followed each evening were not born from fear. They were born from understanding. We will move slowly through this world, through the walls of the cabin, the fire on the hearth, the food kept underground, the layers of the bed, the sounds of the winter night. Each element will unfold at its own pace. So settle in. Let the story begin. In the early decades of the 19th century, winter on the American frontier arrived as it always had, with the shortening of days, the hardening of the ground, and the slow disappearance of everything green. Families who had built their cabins in clearings and hollows began the familiar seasonal shift toward enclosure, stacking wood, reinforcing walls, drawing closer to the fire. These preparations had been made for generations, and they were made again each autumn without ceremony. But the winters of the years between 1810 and 1819 carried something additional. The cold during this period reached into ranges that even experienced settlers had rarely encountered. Rivers that usually remained navigable froze early and stayed frozen late. Crops that had come through mild winters before were wiped out entirely. The growing season contracted, and families that had survived on narrow margins found themselves pressed harder than they had been before. The cause was remote and largely unknown to those living through it. A series of large volcanic eruptions in the preceding years had sent enormous volumes of ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. These particles dispersed slowly around the globe, dimming the sunlight that reached the Earth's surface and lowering temperatures across entire continents. The cooling was not dramatic in any single week or month. It was cumulative, persistent, and expressed itself most clearly in the length and severity of the winters. In North America, the effects were felt across a wide range of latitudes. Communities in the northeastern states and across the Appalachian highlands experienced frosts in midsummer and snowfalls that lingered through months that would ordinarily have been mild. In the more isolated settlements of the interior, where a family's survival depended directly on what they had stored and what their shelter could hold, these conditions tested everything that had been built, prepared, and practiced. For the families in log cabins on the frontier, this decade did not arrive with a name. They did not know they were living through a period of global atmospheric disruption. They knew only that the cold came early, stayed long, and demanded more of them than they were accustomed to giving. The strategies they relied upon, the thickness of their walls, the quality of their firewood, the depth of their root cellars, were the same strategies that had served their parents and grandparents. But the cold decade, as it would later be called, pressed those strategies to their limits. What is worth noting is that most families did survive. The methods they had inherited and refined held. The cabin endured. The fire was kept through the night. This period of sustained cold did not break the frontier. It revealed with unusual clarity which elements of frontier life were essential and which were merely comfortable. The log cabin, in this light, becomes more than a simple dwelling. It becomes a precise answer to a precise problem: how to sustain a human body through months of sustained cold, without electricity, without insulation in the modern sense, and without any guarantee that tomorrow would be warmer. The story of winter survival on the frontier is not a story of exceptional people doing exceptional things. It is a story of accumulated knowledge, of techniques passed from family to family, adapted season by season, and and applied with the kind of quiet competence that comes from knowing that there is no alternative. The cold decade made the stakes of that knowledge unusually visible, but the knowledge itself was older than the decade, and it would outlast it. It is this knowledge, practical, physical, deeply embedded in the routines of daily life, that the pages that follow will trace, not in the spirit of difficulty or endurance, but in the spirit of understanding how a small group of people in a small wooden structure kept themselves warm through the long American winter. That is where we begin. When settlers moved onto the American frontier in the early 19th century, the first structure they built was almost always small, quick, and made with round, unpeeled logs. It went up in days rather than weeks. It was a place to sleep in while the harder work of establishing a farm began, a starting point, not a destination. This structure was the cabin. The log house was something else. It came later, when a family had been in a place long enough to know they intended to stay. Its logs were hewn flat on 2 or 4 sides with a broadaxe, giving the walls a tighter fit, and the interior a more finished quality. The corners were notched with greater precision. The floor, if the family could manage it, was laid with sawn boards rather than bare earth or rough split puncheons. The roof had a steeper pitch, designed to shed snow rather than hold it. This distinction between the rough cabin and the more carefully made house was understood by everyone on the frontier, and it carried meaning beyond the merely practical. A family still living in a round log cabin after several years was a family that had not yet committed, or had not yet had the resources to commit, to permanence. A hewn log house said something different. It said that a family had taken root. But the distinction was also thermal, and this is where the engineering becomes relevant. A wall of hewn logs fit more closely than a wall of round ones. The gaps between round logs were wider and more irregular, requiring more chinking material and more frequent maintenance. A well-made hewn wall had thinner, more uniform gaps that sealed more reliably and lost less heat to drafts. Over the course of a winter night, this difference was not trivial. The cabin that shed heat quickly required more fuel to stay warm. The house that held heat longer was more forgiving of a fire that burned lower. The thickness of the walls also mattered. Logs used in serious construction were often 16 inches or more in diameter. At that thickness, the wood itself had a thermal quality that builders today describe as mass. A massive wall absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly during the night. It does not transmit temperature changes quickly from outside to inside. This means that the cold of a winter night takes time to work its way through the wall, and the warmth stored in the wood from the daytime fire continues to radiate into the room long after the flames have died down. This principle, that a thick wall could serve as a kind of slow battery for heat, was understood by frontier builders in practical terms, even if not in the language of physics. They had experienced it. A cabin with thin walls went cold quickly when the fire dropped. A house with thick, well-fitted walls held its warmth through the early morning hours, easing the effort of kindling the next day's fire. Some builders experimented with roofline geometry as well. Structures with steep, narrow profiles reduced the overall surface area, exposed to the cold outside air. Less surface area meant less heat lost through the envelope of the building. Certain steep roof designs in particular were noted for their ability to retain usable warmth for extended periods after the last fuel was added. In some accounts, up to 12 hours. The choice of timber species added another layer of consideration. Straight-trunked hardwoods were preferred not only for their structural strength, but for their density. A denser wood held heat within the wall more effectively than a lighter, more porous one. The selection of timber was therefore not simply a matter of what was available in the clearing. It was a deliberate choice, made with an understanding of what the wall needed to do. None of this was written down in textbooks or taught in schools. It was knowledge carried in the hands and the memory. Passed from a father who had built a cabin in an earlier settlement to a son building one in a new place, from a neighbor who had survived several winters to a family that had not yet faced one. The hewn log house was the result of this kind of accumulated, embodied understanding. A structure shaped not by theory, but by the specific, recurring consequences of getting it wrong. To stand inside a well-made frontier house in February with snow against the walls and a fire burning on the hearth was to experience the result of that understanding. The walls held. The cold stayed outside. The warmth gathered in the room and remained there, slowly, through the night. That was what the house was for, before a log cabin could hold warmth, before the fire could be banked and the family could sleep. The wood in the walls had already been performing its work for months. The trees that became the cabin's logs had been standing in the forest before any of this began, growing in density over decades, accumulating the mass that would later slow the movement of cold through the wall. The choice of which trees to cut was the first decision in a long chain of preparations. Frontier builders preferred straight-trunked hardwoods. Oak, hickory, ash, and maple were valued for their structural qualities, but equally for their density. A cubic foot of white oak weighs considerably more than a cubic foot of pine. That additional weight comes from tighter wood grain and denser cell structure. In a wall, this density translates directly into thermal mass, the capacity to absorb and store heat. A log that absorbs radiant heat from the fire during the day continues releasing that stored warmth slowly into the room as the night deepens and the fire drops. The same species that built the walls also provided the fuel, and here the settlers developed a careful understanding of what each type of wood offered once it was cut and burned. Not all firewood was equal. The heat that a log could deliver, measured in British thermal units, or BTUS, varied significantly across species, and experienced settlers knew these differences well. Shagbark hickory was considered the finest firewood on the frontier. A cord of well-seasoned hickory contained roughly 27 million BTUS, more than almost any other North American species, and it burned with a strong, steady heat that produced an excellent bed of coals. White oak was close behind, valued for its slow burn and long-lasting coal. It was the wood most often chosen for the overnight fire because it had the patience to smolder through the early hours of the morning without needing attention. Sugar maple burned cleanly and with low smoke. White ash had the unusual quality of burning reliably, even when not. Fully seasoned, a useful characteristic on the frontier, where the ideal of a full year's drying time was not always achievable. Black locust deserves particular mention. Dense and resistant to decay, it burned at high heat and lasted well in the stove or hearth. A locust log placed on the fire late in the evening was known to hold the overnight coal better than most other species. Its resistance to rot also made it a practical choice for any wood that would be stored outdoors through a wet season. What all of these preferred species shared was seasoning, the process of drying after cutting. Green wood, freshly felled, holds significant moisture within its cells. When burned, that moisture must first be evaporated before the wood can produce heat, which means a portion of the fire's energy goes toward water rather than warming the room. Green wood burns cooler, smokes more heavily, and produces higher volumes of creosote in the chimney, a sticky residue that built up in the flue and was a primary cause of chimney fires. Seasoned wood, cut and stacked in an earlier season and allowed to dry for a year, had shed most of that moisture. It ignited more easily, burned hotter, and produced a cleaner coal bed. The difference between a fire of green wood and a fire of well-seasoned oak was not subtle. It was the difference between a room that warmed slowly and a room that held its heat through the night. The cutting and stacking of firewood was therefore not a task left to the weeks before winter. It was a summer and autumn undertaking, begun early enough that the cut wood had time to dry before the cold arrived. The woodlot, the managed grove from which fuel was harvested, required attention through the entire year. Trees were felled in the dormant season when the sap had retreated and the moisture content was lower. Logs were split and stacked with space between the pieces to allow airflow. A good woodpile was sheltered from rain, but open to wind. The volume of wood required to heat a cabin through a full frontier winter was substantial. A single season supply could run to several cords, each cord representing a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. Gathering and preparing this fuel was one of the most labor-intensive tasks of the frontier calendar. measured in weeks of sustained physical effort. It was the kind of work that had to be done before the cold came, because once winter had arrived, the opportunity for preparation was gone. What the settlers understood, and what the wood itself embodied, was a simple principle. Warmth in winter was not found in winter. It was gathered in summer. The heat that sustained the family through the coldest nights of February had been harvested months earlier, stored in the dry mass of split hickory and oak, and drawn out slowly through the long, dark hours. The wood held the cold out not only as a wall, but as a fuel, patient, dense, and prepared well in advance for the work it would be asked to do. A log wall, even one carefully built from straight, well-fitted timber, does not seal itself. The logs, as they dry and settle after construction, shift and warp. The gaps between them, called chinks, open and close with the seasons, widening in the dry cold of winter and narrowing again in the damp warmth of summer. Left unaddressed, these gaps would allow cold air to move freely through the wall, undoing much of the work that the thickness of the logs was meant to accomplish. Sealing the chinks was therefore not a finishing detail. It was a continuous, seasonal obligation. The process was layered, and each layer served a distinct purpose. The first layer was rigid chinking, pieces of stone, split shingles, or small wedges of wood driven into the larger gaps between the logs. These rigid fillers served as structural support, reducing the volume of space that the subsequent softer materials would need to fill. Without this foundation, layer, the weight of the daubing above would cause it to slump and crack. The rigid chink held the shape of the gap while the rest of the work was completed around it. Over the rigid chinking came the soft filler, moss pressed into the remaining crevices, or straw, or oakum, a fibrous material prepared from hemp. In some regions and by some families, dried dung was used as a filler. These soft materials conform to irregular surfaces in a way that stone could not, creating a continuous tactile base for the next layer. Their primary function was adhesion, giving the outer daub something to grip. The daubing itself was a mixture of clay, water, and a binder. Hair, horsehair, or cattle hair was commonly mixed into the clay to add tensile strength and reduce cracking as the material dried. Straw served the same purpose in areas where hair was less available. The consistency of the mix mattered. Too dry and it would not adhere. Too wet and it would shrink dramatically as it cured, pulling away from the logs and leaving new gaps where old ones had been filled. A well-mixed daub was applied by hand, pressed firmly into the chink from the outside, and smoothed across the surface of the surrounding logs. In many cabins, a final coat of whitewash was applied over the dried daubing. Whitewash was made from lime and water, and it served several functions at once. It reflected light into the dim interior of the cabin, brightening a space that received little natural illumination through its small, often paper-covered windows. It filled hairline cracks that had opened as the daub settled, and it continued to harden over time as the calcium hydroxide in the lime slowly reabsorbed carbon dioxide from the air and converted back into calcium carbonate, a gentle, ongoing process of self-repair that added to the seal's durability. The chemistry of traditional lime-based daubing had a further advantage that was not widely understood at the time, but was consistently observed in practice. Modern cement mortars, when applied to wood, trap moisture against the log surface. Over years, this trapped moisture promotes rot and provides favorable conditions for insect infestation. The logs beneath the cement mortar slowly degrade from the inside. Lime behaves differently. It is hygroscopic. It draws moisture away from surrounding materials rather than trapping it. Applied to a log wall, a lime-based daub wicks moisture outward, allowing the log to dry rather than stay wet. Over time, the lime continues to harden, while the wood it surrounds remains healthier than it would under a waterproof seal. The frontier builders who used this material were solving a durability problem that modern restorers working with old log buildings are often still working to understand. The chinking cycle followed the calendar. Autumn was the primary season for inspection and repair. Before the cold arrived, and while the days were still long enough for outdoor work, The Uruk family would walk the exterior of the cabin, pressing their fingers along each course of logs, feeling for the cold draft that marked a failing seal. Where gaps had opened, the old material was raked out and new daub was applied. Where whitewash had flaked, a fresh coat was brushed on. This was not glamorous work. It was slow, repetitive, and often done in failing light as the season turned. But it was work that the cabin required in order to function. A well-chinked wall was a different thermal object than a poorly chinked one. It directed the cold to go around the cabin rather than through it, and it kept the family's accumulated heat, their body warmth, the fire's radiation, the slow release from the log mass, contained within the room. In this sense, the maintenance of the chinking was maintenance of the cabin's most fundamental purpose. The wall was not simply a barrier. It was a managed system, adjusted each year in response to the season, responding to the behavior of the wood, and renewed as long as the family lived within it. There is a quality in the walls of a well-built frontier cabin that is easy to overlook when thinking only of thickness and tightness. The walls breathed. This was not a poetic description. It was a functional characteristic built into the materials themselves that shaped the long-term health of the structure and the people living inside it. The lime used in traditional daubing was the key. When mixed with water and applied to the wall, it existed in a form called calcium hydroxide, a mildly alkaline paste that was soft, workable, and responsive to moisture. As it dried and cured, it slowly absorbed carbon dioxide from the surrounding air and converted back into calcium carbonate, the mineral form of limestone. This conversion happened over months and years, not hours. The result was a material that continued to harden long after it was applied, gradually becoming more stone-like and more durable. But the more significant property was its behavior with water. Calcium hydroxide is hydrophilic. It attracts moisture rather than repelling it. Applied to a log wall, lime daub drew moisture away from the wood surface and released it to the exterior. In practical terms, this meant that the logs stayed drier than they would have behind a waterproof seal. And dry wood resists rot. Rot in a log wall begins with moisture. Fungal organisms that break down wood fiber require dampness to survive and spread. A wall that traps moisture against the log, holding it in place behind a cement-like surface, creates exactly the conditions those organisms need. The wood softens from within, and the damage can progress invisibly for years before it becomes visible on the surface. By the time a family noticed the problem, the structural integrity of the wall might already be compromised. Lime daubing prevented this by keeping the moisture moving, water that entered the wall from outside, from rain, from snow-packed, against the base of the logs, from the humid air of the cabin interior, was not trapped. It was wicked through the lime layer and released. The walls stayed damp in the way a field does after rain, briefly, then dry again. This wicking behavior also addressed a concern that was very immediate to frontier families, though they understood it in different terms. Damp cold is felt more acutely than dry cold. A cabin interior with high humidity feels colder at a given temperature than one with lower humidity. This is partly physiological. Moist air transfers heat away from the skin more efficiently than dry air, and partly a matter of how dampness interacts with clothing and bedding. Wet wool does not insulate as well as dry wool. Blankets that have absorbed moisture from the air are heavier and less effective than dry ones. A wall that managed its own humidity therefore contributed to the perceived warmth of the interior in ways that went beyond simple draft prevention. By keeping the moisture content of the cabin's air within a reasonable range, the lime wall allowed the family's clothing, bedding, and bodies to function as insulators more effectively. The thermal benefit was real, even if the mechanism was not something that frontier families described in these terms. The breathing quality of the wall also protected against a class of respiratory illness that was a genuine concern in close, poorly ventilated winter dwellings. When a family and their animals spent the winter months in a small sealed space, the buildup of moisture from breath and bodies was significant. A wall that absorbed and released that moisture, rather than allowing it to condense on cold surfaces and create persistent dampness, helped keep the interior drier and the air somewhat cleaner. Settlers who observed this over multiple winters came to a practical conclusion that they might have expressed simply, a well-chinked cabin with good lime on the walls stayed warmer and kept the family healthier through the winter. The reasoning behind this observation was not available to them. The chemistry of hydration, carbonation, and vapor transfer was not part of the vocabulary of the frontier. But the observation itself was reliable, and it was passed along. Modern builders who have worked with old log structures and attempted to restore or preserve them have sometimes applied contemporary cement-based mortars to the chinks, materials that are stronger, more durable, and easier to apply than traditional lime mixes. The results have often been damaging. The cement seals moisture against the wood, and within years, the logs behind the mortar begin to rot. Restoration specialists working on historic log buildings now return to lime-based mortars specifically because of the wicking behavior that the original builders understood through experience. The breathing wall, in this light, is not a feature of a primitive or temporary construction. It is a solution to a problem that more modern materials have sometimes made worse. The frontier cabin did not simply stand against the cold. It managed its own interior environment, slowly, seasonally, and without any intervention beyond the annual reapplication of whitewash. The wall worked, and it worked because of what it was made of. The fireplace that anchored the early frontier cabin was a large masonry structure, stone or brick, built wide and deep, occupying a substantial portion of one wall. It served as the household's source of heat, its primary light after dark, and the place where all cooking was done. In the morning, it was kindled. Through the day, it was fed. In the evening, it was managed down toward the overnight state. The fireplace organized the day as much as the sun did. Its limitations, however, were significant and well known to those who lived with it. The geometry of an open hearth is not efficient for retaining heat. The combustion happens at the front of the firebox, where it is visible, and the products of that combustion, hot gases and smoke, travel rapidly up and out through the chimney. Along with the smoke goes a substantial portion of the fire's thermal energy. Estimates from later study of fireplace mechanics have placed the heat loss through the chimney of a standard open hearth at around 90%. The room received what remained, radiant heat from the flames and the hot back wall of the firebox, but little of the convective warmth that a more enclosed system could have delivered. This was not simply a matter of comfort. In a cabin trying to maintain a survivable temperature through a night of deep cold, the efficiency of the heating system determined how much wood needed to be gathered, how often the fire required attention, and how far the room temperature dropped in the hours before dawn. A hearth that wasted most of its fuel through the chimney required the family to burn significantly more wood and to wake more frequently through the night to add to the fire. The first meaningful improvement came in the mid-18th century, when Benjamin Franklin developed an enclosed iron stove designed to be placed within or near the existing fireplace opening. The Franklin stove surrounded the fire on more sides than an open hearth, using the mass of cast iron to absorb and radiate heat. It also incorporated a convection chamber, a space behind the firebox through which room air could circulate, picking up heat from the metal before returning to the room. This convective loop distributed warmth more evenly and continued to deliver heat from the iron even after the visible flames had subsided. The Franklin stove did not solve every problem. Its chimney arrangement was complex and not always effective, and early versions had drawbacks that limited their adoption. But the principle it introduced, that enclosing the fire could dramatically improve the proportion of heat delivered to the room, proved durable and was refined by subsequent inventors and manufacturers through the following decades. The Rittenhouse stove of the late 18th century addressed one of the Franklin design's ventilation problems by improving the pipe arrangement, reducing the risk of smoke entering the room. This was not a minor concern. In a sealed winter cabin, where every gap in the walls was chinked against the cold and the windows were often covered, inadequate venting of combustion gases was a genuine hazard. Families who spent the night with a smoking hearth woke with headaches and sore throats. In extreme cases, poor ventilation was fatal. By 1834, Philo Stewart's Oberlin stove had brought the cast iron cooking and heating stove to a compact and practical form. The Oberlin design allowed for precise temperature regulation, with adjustable dampers that controlled the flow of air to the fire, and therefore the rate of combustion. A partially closed damper slowed the fire, extending the burn time of a given quantity of wood and allowing the stove to maintain a steady, lower heat for hours without requiring additional fuel. This was exactly the quality needed for the overnight fire. The shift from open hearth to enclosed stove changed the rhythm of the night in a concrete way. An open fire left to burn without tending would either flare up and exhaust its fuel quickly or die down to a low state that produced little heat. An enclosed stove with its damper adjusted could sustain a slow, controlled burn through an entire sleep cycle, keeping the room at a survivable temperature without anyone needing to wake and feed it. The family could go to bed with reasonable confidence that the room would still be warm, or at least not dangerous, when they rose before dawn. The masonry heater, a technology more common in European traditions that some immigrant communities carried to America, represented a further refinement of the enclosed fire principle. In a masonry heater, the combustion gases traveled through a long winding channel within a large thermal mass of brick or soapstone before exiting through the chimney. This extended path allowed the heat to transfer from the gases into the mass, rather than escaping immediately to the outside. Once the fire burned out, the mass continued radiating heat into the room for many hours, sometimes through an entire day from a single morning fire. Not every frontier family had access to an iron stove or the resources to build a masonry heater. The open hearth remained in use throughout the century in many households, but the direction of change was consistent, from open to enclosed, from wasteful to retained, from constant tending to managed duration. Each step along that progression represented hours of sleep recovered and cords of wood saved, concrete improvements in a life measured carefully against its own resources. At some point each evening, when the last tasks of the day were finished and the family was preparing to sleep, the fire required a particular kind of attention. It could not simply be left burning. A fully burning fire through the night would exhaust its fuel before morning and leave the cabin cold by the time anyone woke. It could not be extinguished either. Restarting a fire from cold ash with flint and steel was slow, demanding work, especially in the dark and cold of early morning. What was needed was a middle state, the fire neither burning freely nor fully out. Achieving this state was called banking the fire, and it was one of the most practiced skills of frontier domestic life. The process began with the evening's fire already reduced to a strong bed of coals. The deep orange mass that remained after the active flames had subsided. These coals held a substantial quantity of heat contained within their dense, slow-burning structure. The goal of banking was to preserve this heat through the night, slowing combustion to the point where the coals neither grew nor died, but simply held. The first step was raking. Using a long iron poker or a simple wooden stick, the person tending the fire drew the live coals together into a compact pile near the center or back of the firebox. Consolidating the coals reduced the surface area exposed to air, which slowed the rate at which oxygen could reach the burning material and sustain combustion. A spread-out coal bed burned faster because more of its surface was in contact with the surrounding air. A raked, concentrated mound burned more slowly for the same reason that a tightly closed fist holds warmth longer than an open hand. Over the consolidated coals went ash, drawn from the edges of the firebox where it had accumulated throughout the day, or sometimes gathered from a separate ash bin. A layer of ash, packed over and around the coal mound, acted as an insulating blanket. It was permeable enough to allow the slow passage of the small amount of oxygen needed to sustain the smolder, but dense enough to prevent the rapid airflow that would cause the coals to burn up quickly. The ash held the heat inside the coal mass and moderated the combustion to its slowest sustainable rate. In a stove rather than an open hearth, the dampers served a related function. Partially closing the air intake damper reduced the oxygen available to the fire, slowing combustion directly. Partially closing the flue damper reduced the draft that drew air through the firebox, achieving a similar result by a different mechanism. An experienced stove user could set these dampers with enough precision to determine within a reasonable range how long the overnight fuel supply would last and at what intensity the stove would be burning by morning. A properly banked fire required a final addition, one or two substantial pieces of hardwood placed over or alongside the coal mound before the ash was applied. These logs would not ignite immediately. They would sit against the smoldering coals through the early hours of the night, slowly warming from the outside inward, beginning to char at their surfaces, and eventually, sometime in the middle hours of the night, catching enough to add their own heat to the system. By morning, they would have burned down to a fresh layer of coals sitting atop the remnants of the evening's bed. The fire had continued through the night without any attention. This seed fire, the surviving coal at the heart of the banked ash, was a household resource as significant as any stored food or tool. A family that maintained its fire through the winter never had to start one from scratch. The seed fire carried from one day to the next, from 1 week to the next, through the entire cold season, serving as a continuous thread of warmth connecting each morning to the last. It was tended with the same regularity as the animals, the water supply, and the children. When the fire went entirely out, a dead hearth, the household felt its absence immediately. The room began to cool from the moment the last coal expired. In deep winter, the temperature inside an unheated cabin could approach the temperature outside within a matter of hours. Everything that depended on the fire, the warmth of the room, the ability to cook, the safety of the family through the night, was suspended until the fire was restarted. Starting a fire from nothing with flint and steel was not a quick process. It required dry tinder, careful technique, and enough warmth in the hands to strike effectively. In extreme cold, with numb fingers and limited light, it could take considerable time. Some families kept a tinder box specifically prepared for this contingency, dry fungal material or char cloth that caught a spark reliably. But even with good materials, a cold start was far harder than maintaining what was already burning. In the worst cases, when a family's fire had died in the night and the cold was too severe for a reliable restart, children were sometimes sent to a neighboring cabin to borrow coals. They carried a cast iron pot or a metal kettle, received a scoop of live coals from the neighbor's hearth, and carried them home through the snow, walking carefully to keep the coals from cooling in the wind. The borrowed fire was placed in the dead hearth, ash and kindling arranged around it, and the household's flame was restored. That a child could walk to a neighbor's cabin in winter cold and return with fire was a form of community infrastructure. Informal, unorganized, and entirely reliable. The work of keeping the winter fire was not measured in evenings, it was measured in seasons. The wood that burned in December had been cut and split in the spring or summer of the same year, stacked through the summer months, and drawn upon from autumn onward. By the time the coldest weeks arrived, that wood had been drying for 6 months or more, losing the moisture that would otherwise diminish its heat, and waiting in the woodpile for the moment it was needed. A frontier family's relationship with firewood was one of the most labor-intensive relationships they maintained. It began with the selection of trees, not the nearest or the most convenient, but the ones that would perform best in the stove or hearth. The qualities that made a wood valuable as fuel were the same qualities that made certain trees dense and slow-growing: tight grain, heavy fiber, high cellulose content. These trees did not grow quickly, and finding them in sufficient quantity within a manageable distance of the cabin was part of the practical geography of frontier life. Shagbark hickory stood at the top of most settlers' preference lists. Its density was exceptional, and a well-seasoned hickory log delivered heat at a rate that few other species could match. The coals it left behind were thick and long-lasting, exactly the quality needed for banking the fire through the night. When hickory burned, it also released a characteristic slightly smoky aroma that became inseparable, for many families, from the smell of winter warmth. A cabin in February that smelled of hickory smoke was a cabin whose fire was working as it should. White oak was the most reliable alternative, and in many regions, the more commonly available one. Its heat output was slightly lower than hickory's, but still substantial, and its burn characteristics were well suited to the long overnight fire. Oak burned steadily and at a measured pace, producing a coal bed that held together rather than crumbling into ash quickly. A split oak log placed on the fire at bedtime and a good banking of ash over the coals could carry the stove through 6 or 7 hours without attention. Black locust, though less frequently discussed in popular accounts of frontier life, was prized in regions where it grew. Its wood was denser than oak and resisted decay so effectively that fence posts of black locust were known to outlast the farms they enclosed. As firewood, it burned hot and long, and its resistance to moisture meant that even imperfectly seasoned locust produced a more reliable fire than many better-dried softwoods. White ash had a particular practical advantage that experienced settlers appreciated. Most hardwoods needed a full year of drying before they burned well. Green ash, freshly cut, still held considerable moisture, and burning it produced the creosote buildup and reduced heat that characterized all wet wood. But white ash dried faster than most comparable species and could produce a usable fire even when cut in the same autumn. It was burned. In years when the summer's wood preparation had fallen short, or when an unexpectedly early winter demanded more fuel than had been stacked, white ash provided a workable reserve. Sugar maple rounded out the preferred species in regions where it was abundant. Its burn was clean and produced little smoke, a quality valued in the enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces of winter cabins. Maple also split readily along the grain, reducing the labor of preparation. And in early spring, before the fire season was entirely over, the same trees that had provided fuel through the winter began to produce sap, which could be collected and boiled down into syrup. The maple tree gave twice in seasons separated by only a few weeks. The preparation of the wood was a process that unfolded over months. Trees were felled in the late winter or early spring, when the sap was low and the wood's moisture content was at its seasonal minimum. The felled trunks were cut to stove length, typically 16 to 18 inches for the enclosed stoves that became increasingly common through the century, and then split. Splitting exposed the interior of the log to air, dramatically accelerating the drying process. A round log takes far longer to season than a split one, because moisture can only escape from the end grain and the outer surface. A split log opens new surfaces and allows the interior to dry from multiple directions simultaneously. The split wood was stacked in rows with space between the pieces to allow airflow, sheltered from rain by a simple roof of boards or bark, but open on the sides to the drying wind. Through the summer months, the pile shrank in weight as moisture left the wood, and by autumn the family could lift a piece and judge by its lightness and the dryness of its surface whether it had seasoned sufficiently. Wood that still felt heavy, or that showed moisture at the fresh end of a split face, needed more time. The quantity required was considerable, heating a single room through a full frontier winter, roughly 5 months of cold, with the worst weeks demanding near constant fire, consumed several cords of wood. Families with stoves rather than open hearths burned less, because the efficiency of the enclosed system meant that more of each log's heat stayed in the room rather than traveling up the chimney. But even with a good stove, the woodpile at the beginning of winter needed to be large enough to reach the other side of it. Misjudging the supply meant either burning wood that was not fully seasoned or cutting and splitting new wood in the cold. Hard work under the best conditions, and significantly harder with frozen ground and shortened days. In the rhythm of the frontier winter, certain small failures carried consequences that extended well beyond their apparent scale. A broken axle on the wagon, a compromised seal in the root cellar, a tear in the only wool blanket. Each of these was a problem that could be endured for a day or managed with improvisation. But each also introduced a vulnerability into a system that had little tolerance for gaps. The Dead Hearth belonged to this category. A fire that went entirely out was not simply an inconvenience. It was a rupture in the household's primary defense against the cold. The firebox of a well-managed stove or hearth almost never went truly cold during the winter months. The banking practice, raking coals together and covering them with ash each evening, was specifically designed to prevent this. A properly banked fire could survive 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours without fuel, preserving a live coal at its center that could be coaxed back to flame with a few pieces of dry kindling and a careful breath. Families that maintained this practice maintained a continuous fire from the first cold night of autumn through to the final thaw of spring. But the conditions that could kill a banked fire were not always preventable. A night of unusual severity, with temperatures that dropped faster or further than expected, could draw heat from the coal mass faster than the ash insulation could compensate. An interrupted sleep cycle, a sick child, a restless animal, any disturbance that occupied the adults through the early morning hours might mean that the stove went untended past the point at which the overnight fuel had exhausted itself. Occasionally, the ash covering was applied too thickly, smothering the coals entirely rather than insulating them. The result in each case was the same, a firebox that held nothing but cold ash by morning. The immediate response was an attempt to restart using whatever resources the household had prepared for the purpose. A tinderbox, a small metal container holding char cloth or dried fungal material, was kept specifically for this contingency. Char cloth was made by heating small pieces of cotton fabric in a sealed metal container, driving off the volatile compounds and leaving a carbonized material that caught a spark more readily than raw fiber. When a spark from flint and steel landed on good char cloth in a dry environment, it held and spread slowly as a glowing ember that could be transferred to a nest of dry tinder and blown to flame. In ideal conditions, this process took only a few minutes. In the cold of a dead fire cabin in winter, conditions were rarely ideal. The hands holding the flint and steel were stiff. The breath used to coax the tinder nest to flame came out in visible clouds that condensed on the coldest surfaces. The tinderbox materials, if they had absorbed any moisture from the winter air inside the cabin, might not catch it the first attempt, or the second. A family could spend 30 or 40 minutes working to produce a flame from cold materials, during which the cabin continued to cool around them. If the household's own resources failed, or if the tinder had been depleted and not yet replaced, the alternative was to go to a neighbor. This was not a trivial undertaking. Frontier settlements were spread across distances that were significant even in good conditions. In winter, with snow on the ground and cold that could cause frostbite within minutes of exposure, sending someone to a neighboring cabin, often half a mile away, sometimes more, was a serious decision. It was also, almost invariably, made without hesitation. The person sent was usually a child old enough to make the walk reliably. The request was understood by any neighbor without explanation. The fire had gone out, and coals were needed. The neighbor's household, itself tending its fire through the same long winter, would open the firebox and shovel a portion of live coals into the container the child had brought. A cast-iron pot, a metal kettle with a lid, any vessel that could hold burning material without igniting. The child would carry this carefully home, shielding it from the wind, walking as quickly as possible without spilling. The borrowed coals were placed in the dead firebox and surrounded with prepared kindling, dry, fine material that would catch quickly from the heat of the coals, without requiring them to be at full temperature. Larger pieces were added progressively as the small fire established itself, and within a quarter of an hour, the household's fire was restored. The container was returned to the neighbor at the next convenient opportunity, usually with some acknowledgement, a portion of food, an offer of help with a task, though the transaction was rarely formalized. It was simply what neighbors did. This practice of borrowing coals was common enough across frontier communities that it shaped the social texture of isolated settlements in a concrete way. The fire was not, in practical terms, a private household resource. It was a shared one, distributed across the community and maintained collectively. A family whose fire went out could restore it from a neighbor's. A family that lent coals knew the loan would be reciprocated if their own fire ever failed. The isolation of the frontier cabin, which could seem absolute from the outside, was in practice threaded through with these small, functional dependencies. In regions where winters were most severe and settlements most sparse, some families maintained a secondary fire specifically as an insurance measure. A small stove in a room adjacent to the main living space, or a banked fire in the barn where the animals were kept, that could serve as a backup source of coals if the household's primary fire died. The barn fire also kept the water troughs from freezing and protected the animals themselves from the worst cold. Like so much of frontier winter management, it was a redundancy built from experience, from at least one winter in which the primary system had failed, and the cost of that failure had been felt. Below the frost line, the earth maintains a temperature that the winter above it cannot reach. At a depth of several feet in most parts of the eastern and midwestern United States, the ground stays within a narrow range, cool in summer, above freezing in winter, held steady by the thermal mass of the soil itself. Frontier families understood this property and built their food storage systems around it. The root cellar was the result, a man-made cavity in the ground, positioned to take advantage of the Earth's own insulating depth, designed to keep stored food alive through the months when nothing above ground could sustain it. The most common form was dug into the side of a hill or slope. This orientation allowed the cellar to be accessed from a door cut into the hillside rather than through a hatch in the cabin floor, though floor hatches were also used in flat terrain. A hillside cellar was easier to build. The excavation worked with the slope rather than against it, and its earth ceiling was deeper and more insulating than a cellar dug straight down from level ground. The door, which faced the slope, was the only point of contact between the cellar's controlled interior and the variable temperatures outside. The interior of a well-constructed root cellar stayed between approximately 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit through the winter. This range was not accidental. It was colder than the temperatures that encouraged bacterial spoilage and mold. Growth, but above the freezing point at which the cellular structure of vegetables ruptures and the produce becomes unusable. Managing the cellar's temperature meant managing its ventilation, opening the door briefly on mild days to let warmer air in when the cellar had drifted too cold, keeping it closed during extreme cold to prevent the temperature from dropping below freezing. The root cellar required attention, but not constant attention. It was checked every few days, and the small adjustments made to its ventilation were sufficient to keep it within the desired range. Potatoes were the primary occupant. A bushel of potatoes represented a substantial quantity of calories in a compact form, and they stored well in the conditions the cellar provided, just above freezing, with high humidity to prevent them from drying out and shriveling. Exposure to light caused potatoes to develop solanine, a compound that gave the skin a green tint and an unpleasant flavor, so the cellar's darkness was an asset as well as a consequence of being underground. A family with a well-stocked potato bin could rely on it as the caloric foundation of their diet through the months when no fresh food was available. Turnips and beets occupied similar conditions. They were less calorie-dense than potatoes but provided vitamins and minerals that a winter diet heavy in preserved meat and dried grain might otherwise lack. Cabbage, stored whole or packed in crocks as fermented sauerkraut, was another staple. Fermentation, the conversion of sugars to lactic acid by naturally occurring bacteria, preserved the cabbage indefinitely and added to its nutritional value. A crock of sauerkraut in the root cellar was a reliable source of vitamin C through months when fresh vegetables were unavailable, though this specific nutritional understanding was not the framework within which frontier families thought about it. They knew that people who ate their kraut through the winter were less likely to develop the looseness of the gums and general weakness that characterized scurvy. They knew it from observation across generations. Apples occupied a section of the cellar separately from the root vegetables. They required slightly different conditions, cold but not quite as cold as the potato corner, and at a moderate humidity that prevented them from either freezing or shriveling. The best keeping varieties were those with dense flesh and thick skin. Winesap, Arkansas Black, and similar apples that had been selected over generations specifically for their storage qualities. A barrel of these apples, laid carefully in sawdust or straw to prevent them from touching and bruising one another, could remain edible through February and sometimes into March. Smoked and salted meat was stored in the root cellar's driest and coolest section. The preservation of meat through smoking and salt curing had been practiced for centuries before the American frontier, and the ADICBL techniques were well established. Salt drew moisture out of the meat's surface layers, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that caused putrefaction. Smoking added a second layer of preservation, depositing antimicrobial compounds from the wood smoke onto the meat's surface while simultaneously drying the outer layers. A properly cured ham or side of bacon, stored in a cool, dry cellar, could remain safe to eat through the entire winter and into the following spring. The root cellar existed in a direct relationship with the calendar. Its contents were assembled through the summer and autumn, added to continuously as each crop came in, and was processed. The potatoes were dug in September before the first frost. The apples were picked in October. The last of the cabbages were brought in and packed before the ground froze. The cellar's door was the threshold between the summer's labor and the winter's consumption, and crossing it to retrieve a bucket of potatoes or a jar of preserved meat was a daily reminder of how completely the family's survival depended on preparations made months earlier. In households where enslaved people lived and worked, the root cellar or the potato hole dug beneath the cabin floor served an additional purpose that went beyond food storage. In the narrow space under the floorboards, too low for comfortable movement but accessible to a person willing to crawl, families could keep personal possessions hidden from the oversight of the owner. Small objects of sentimental value, items that represented a measure of privacy and autonomy in conditions designed to deny both. The storage function and this private function coexisted in the same space, representing the full range of what the frontier winter required of people living within it, under very different conditions of freedom. By the time the coldest weeks of the year arrived, the root cellar's contents had already been fixed. Nothing could be added. The question that winter answered was whether what had been stored was enough. The preparation of food on the frontier followed the logic of the fire as much as it followed the logic of hunger. Every dish was shaped by the heat source available, the ingredients that had survived the summer's preservation work, and the time required to produce something edible from raw materials that had been stored underground or dried in the rafters. The evening meal was not assembled quickly. It began in the afternoon, sometimes earlier, and by the time the family gathered around the hearth after dark, much of the work had already been accomplished through slow heat and patience. Cornmeal mush was among the most common evening dishes of the frontier winter. Its preparation was simple in outline and required sustained attention in practice. Coarsely ground cornmeal was added to boiling water in a heavy pot and stirred continuously as it thickened, preventing the meal from settling and scorching against the hot iron. The idle stirring was slow work. Steady circles with a long wooden spoon, maintaining movement while the mixture absorbed the water and swelled. A pot of mush that was started by mid-afternoon could be ready by early evening, thick and hot, eaten directly from the pot with a wooden spoon or poured into a pan to cool and slice. The mush would often be made in a quantity larger than the evening required. What was left in the pot was allowed to cool and set overnight into a firm mass. By morning, it had solidified completely. The solidified mush was then sliced into pieces and fried in lard over the morning fire. A dish that required almost no preparation time and provided a dense, calorie-rich start to a day of physical labor. Nothing was wasted. The evening's cooking fed the morning's breakfast. Buckwheat was another grain that shaped the frontier kitchen through the winter months. Unlike corn, which needed to be ground at a mill and stored as meal, buckwheat could be kept as whole groats and ground at home or purchased in small quantities of flour. Its most practical form on the frontier was as a fermented batter. A small portion of buckwheat flour was mixed with water and a live starter. A spoonful of batter saved from the previous batch and left near the warmth of the hearth to ferment overnight. By morning it had risen and developed a mild, sour quality from the activity of the wild yeast and bacteria in the starter. Buckwheat pancakes made from this batter were thin, flexible, and filling. What made this preparation particularly suited to the frontier winter was its self-sustaining quality. The batter did not need to be made fresh from scratch each time. A portion of each day's batch was saved as the starter for the next. The same culture could be maintained for weeks or months, carrying the living fermentation forward through the cold season without requiring any additional ingredients beyond flour and water. A family with a going buckwheat starter had a reliable source of cooked food that demanded minimal effort each morning. Exactly the kind of low-friction sustenance that a winter kitchen needed. Preserved meat provided the protein component of most winter meals. Smoked hams and salt pork were the most common forms, and they were used sparingly, flavoring a pot of beans or cornmeal rather than serving as the centerpiece of the meal. A small piece of salt pork rendered in the iron pot before the mush was added gave the dish a depth of flavor and a fat content that helped sustain the body's heat production through the cold hours. The fat itself was as important as the meat. In deep winter, the caloric demands of maintaining body temperature were higher than in warmer months, and fat, dense with energy, was among the most efficient ways to meet them. Dried fruit hung in the rafters through the summer and autumn offered occasional sweetness to the winter diet. Rings of dried apple strung on cord or laid across wooden frames near the hearth concentrated their sugars as they lost moisture. Reconstituted in a small amount of water and simmered over the fire, they became a simple stewed fruit that could accompany the evening meal or sweeten a portion of cornmeal. Dried pumpkin, similarly preserved, was used in puddings and pies when fat and flour were available to make a crust. The evening meal was eaten by firelight. The cabin was dim by this hour, the windows admitting little natural light even in the afternoon, and by early evening offering none at all. Tallow candles might be lit for tasks that required close work, but their fat was a conserved resource, and many families managed the meal and the early evening hours by firelight alone. The hearth provided enough illumination for eating and conversation, and its orange glow was the visual center of the room from the time the sun went down until the family moved to bed. After the meal, the pot was cleaned with water drawn earlier in the day. Water hauled uphill from a spring or collected from melted snow was not wasted on extended washing. The cleaning was functional rather than thorough. A rinse with a cloth, a wipe of the interior surfaces, enough to remove the residue without consuming water that had cost labor to acquire. The cast iron pot was returned to its hook over the fire or set at the hearth's edge, ready for the morning. The evening meal was never elaborate. It was dense, warm, and sufficient. Its purpose was to sustain the body through the night, to load the metabolic furnace with enough fuel to maintain core temperature through the hours of sleep when the external cold would press hardest against the family's insulation, and the fire would be burning at its lowest. The food served the same function as the banked coals and the layered quilts. It was part of the integrated system of warmth, working from the inside rather than the outside, but working toward exactly the same end. When the meal was finished, and the fire had been banked and the tasks of the day were set aside, there was often one more preparation before sleep. A warm drink, prepared at the hearth and consumed slowly, was part of the closing ritual of the frontier evening. These drinks were not incidental. They were understood, in the practical, experiential terms of the 19th century, as medicine as much as comfort, as useful to the body's preparation for sleep as any blanket or stove adjustment. The understanding of how the body managed cold was not framed in physiological terms on the frontier. There was no language of thermogenesis or vasodilation available to a settler in 1815, but there was accumulated observation, passed through families and communities over generations, that certain warm beverages taken before sleep helped the body hold its heat through the night. A person who went to bed cold was a person whose sleep was interrupted and shallow. A person who went to bed with warmth already distributed. Through their limbs lay down more deeply and woke less often. The experience was consistent enough to become a practice. Caudle was among the oldest of these preparations and was carried into American frontier life from European domestic tradition. It was made from ale or beer mixed with hot water, sometimes with water alone when alcohol was not available, thickened with oatmeal, and spiced with whatever was at hand. Cloves were a common addition, their volatile oils producing warmth on the tongue and in the throat. Mace, the outer coating of the nutmeg seed, contributed a gentler, slightly sweet note. The oatmeal gave the drink a density that made it closer to a thin porridge than a beverage, and this thickness meant it delivered calories along with warmth. Caudle had a long association with recovery from illness and with the care of people in weakened states. It was given to new mothers, to the sick, to the elderly, and to those recovering from exposure to the cold. Its reputation as a restorative beverage made it a natural choice for the end of a hard winter day, not because the family was sick, but because the cold frontier winter made every day a small test of the body's resilience. The drink offered warmth, calories, and a familiar sensory comfort that carried its own settling quality. The hot toddy occupied a different register, simpler in preparation and more directly warming. A measure of whiskey or brandy combined with hot water and sweetened with sugar or honey produced a drink that was brief and direct. The alcohol dilated blood vessels near the skin, producing an immediate sensation of warmth that moved from the throat outward into the limbs. This sensation was real and physiologically grounded, even if the long-term thermal benefit of alcohol consumption in the cold is more complicated than the warmth it produces in the moment. On the frontier, where whiskey was a manufactured product and an economic commodity, distilled from surplus grain and used as currency, as well as beverage, a toddy before bed was not an extravagance. It was a practical application of an available resource. Wassail was the most ceremonial of the warm winter drinks, associated with the holiday weeks of late December and early January, but prepared through the colder months wherever the ingredients were available. Its base was cider or ale, mulled slowly at the hearth's edge in a large pot or iron kettle. Roasted apples were added whole or in pieces, their skins caramelized by the heat and their flesh softened to a yielding tenderness. Honey dissolved into the liquid, adding sweetness and a faint floral note. Ginger and nutmeg completed the spicing. The preparation of wassail was slow and aromatic, its smell filling the cabin as it warmed, marking the transition from the working hours of the day to the resting hours of the night. For households where grain was abundant but alcohol was absent, whether by conviction, scarcity, or preference, acorn coffee served as a warm, dark drink in the cold months. Acorns were gathered in autumn, dried, shelled, and roasted over the fire until their interior darkened and developed a bitter, nutty quality. The roasted kernels were then ground and steeped in hot water. The result was not coffee in the botanical sense, but it produced a warm, slightly bitter liquid that served the same purpose. A hot drink to hold in both hands, to sip slowly at the end of the evening, to carry warmth from the outside in. What these beverages shared was a sensory quality that went beyond the caloric or medicinal. They were warm in the hands before they were warm in the body. The act of holding a cup or mug of hot liquid was itself a form of heat exchange, the palms and fingers absorbing warmth from the vessel, the warmth spreading slowly up the wrists and into the arms. In a cabin where the temperature away from the fire could drop noticeably, this direct, conducted warmth had a specific comfort that was immediate and complete in a way that radiant heat from a distant fire was not. The drinks were also slow. They could not be rushed. Hot liquid requires time to cool to a temperature that can be consumed comfortably, and the sipping of a warm drink naturally imposed a pace of stillness on the person holding it. After a day of physical effort, hauling water, tending animals, splitting wood, cooking, mending, this enforced stillness was its own form of rest. The evening drink was the transition from doing to being, from the day's labor to the night's recovery. When the cup was empty and the fire had settled to its overnight state, sleep was close. The body was warm from within. The room held what heat the banked coals could offer. The quilts waited on the cord bed. The long winter night outside the walls was already well underway. The bed that a frontier family slept in was not a single object. It was a constructed system, a sequence of components, assembled together, each serving a specific purpose in the management of warmth and the support of the sleeping body. Understanding the bed requires understanding it from the ground up, beginning with its foundation. Most frontier beds were built as cord beds. The bedstead, the frame of the bed, was made from wood, typically hewn or sawn from the same hardwoods that built the cabin's walls. 4 corner posts supported 2 side rails and 2 end rails that formed the rectangle of the frame. Into this frame, holes or pegs were set at regular intervals along the inner face of each rail, and between these anchor points, a continuous length of hemp rope was woven in a grid pattern. Lengthwise first, then crosswise, or in a single diagonal weave, depending on the builder's preference. This rope grid was the sleeping surface. It functioned as the springs of its era, providing a degree of give and support that a solid wooden platform could not. Hemp rope under the weight of a sleeping. Body deflected slightly, distributing the load across a broader area and reducing the pressure points that would make a rigid surface uncomfortable over a full night's sleep. The elasticity was modest but present, and its absence, as anyone who has slept on bare boards can confirm, was immediately noticeable. Hemp rope does not maintain its tension indefinitely. Under sustained weight, it stretched and relaxed, and over weeks of use, the rope grid would sag progressively toward the floor. A bed that had sagged significantly placed the sleepers closer to the cold air that accumulated near the ground, and it changed the geometry of the sleeping surface in ways that affected both comfort and warmth. To address this, the ropes were periodically tightened using a wooden bed wrench, a simple lever device that allowed a significant amount of tension to be applied to the rope ends without requiring exceptional hand strength. Tightening the ropes was a routine domestic task, performed every few weeks through the winter. The phrase that entered common usage to describe this necessity, a phrase still in use today, though its origin is largely forgotten, referred to the need to keep the bed taut for a good night's rest. The wrench was a small tool, but a necessary one, and its presence in the household was as practical as the fire poker or the butter churn. The positioning of the bed within the cabin was its own thermal calculation. The floor was the coldest horizontal surface in the room, cold air being denser settled near the ground, while the warmest air accumulated near the ceiling. A bed placed directly on the floor would expose the sleepers to the coldest layer of the room's air and to the chill that conducted upward from the ground itself. The raised frame of the cord bed, typically 18 inches to 2 feet above the floor, lifted the sleepers out of the coldest zone and into the warmer air above. In cabins with a single large room, the bed's placement relative to the hearth was a further consideration. Too close, and the heat of the fire created an uneven warmth that made one side of the bed uncomfortable and left the far side cold when the fire subsided. A moderate distance, close enough to benefit from the hearth's radiant heat in the early evening, far enough to remain at a stable temperature through the night, was the practical ideal. Families who had spent several winters in the same cabin developed an instinctive sense of where this zone was. The legs of the bed frame were sometimes set into small wooden platforms or raised off the floor on wooden blocks. This additional elevation further reduced the drafts that moved along the floor surface on the coldest nights, and it lifted the underside of the rope grid far enough from the ground that cold air could not pool immediately beneath the sleeping surface. In some cabins, the space beneath the bed was used for storage, a location that, by virtue of being enclosed on 3 sides by the bed frame and warmed slightly by the bodies above, was marginally warmer than the open floor, and therefore suitable for storing items that needed protection from the hardest cold. Children in many frontier households slept not in a full cord bed, but in a trundle bed, a smaller frame on low casters or wooden wheels that could be rolled out from beneath the parent's bed at night and pushed back underneath it during the day. This arrangement made efficient use of the limited floor space of the single-room cabin, and it positioned the children within the warmth envelope generated by the adults sleeping directly above them. The heat rising from the parents' bodies and from the quilts above warmed the air around the trundle, providing an additional layer of thermal benefit to the youngest sleepers, who were also the most vulnerable to cold. The cord bed was not comfortable by later standards. The rope surface, even when well tightened, provided a firmness that a modern mattress does not. The frame creaked, the ropes stretched. The whole structure required maintenance, but it served its essential purposes. It lifted the sleepers off the cold floor, provided a stable platform for the layers of insulation that would be placed above it and held together through months of use in conditions that would have quickly deteriorated a more delicate construction. It was built for the winter it would face, and it held. The cord bed was a frame. What transformed it into a sleeping environment capable of sustaining a body through a night of deep cold was everything placed upon it. The accumulated layers of material that trapped warmth, supported the body, and created a microclimate distinct from the air of the room. These layers were chosen and arranged with a practical understanding of how insulation worked, even in the absence of any formal thermal science. The first layer above the rope was the tick. A tick was a large bag made from sturdy, woven fabric, linen or a coarse cotton canvas, sometimes a linen-cotton blend, sewn closed on 3 sides and filled through the 4th, which was then secured with ties or buttons. The filling varied by household and by season, and the choice of filling was a direct reflection of what the family had access to and what they had prioritized. Straw was the most widely available filling. It was cheap, easily replaced each spring, and provided a reasonable degree of cushioning. A fresh straw tick had a slight springiness and a faint agricultural smell that was familiar and not unpleasant. By midwinter, however, straw ticks had compressed significantly under the weight of repeated use. The individual straws broke down, the loft disappeared, and the tick became progressively thinner and less insulating. Straw also harbored insects if it was not replaced regularly. Spring cleaning of the cabin almost always included a complete replacement of the straw ticking, a task that required gathering fresh material and restuffing the bags before the next cold season. Horsehair provided a more durable and more resilient filling. It did not compress as readily as straw, and it maintained more of its original loft through the season. Horsehair was also more resistant to infestation. Its drawbacks were cost and availability. It required horses, which not every frontier family kept in sufficient number to produce significant quantities of hair, and sourcing it in quantity required either a large herd of one's own or access to a community of neighbors with horses to spare. A horsehair tick was a step up from straw, both in practical performance and in what it implied about the household's resources. The feather bed sat above the undertick and was the most prized piece of the sleeping ensemble. A full feather bed was filled with goose down or the softer breast feathers of ducks, material collected over years from the household's own flock or purchased from a neighbor or trader. Down has exceptional thermal properties. Its structure, a central quill radiating fine branching filaments, traps a large volume of still air within a small mass of material. Still air is an excellent insulator. A feather bed thick enough to allow the sleeper to sink partially into its surface created a surrounding pocket of trapped body-warmed air that was significantly warmer than the room around it. The sensation of settling into a feather bed on a cold night was described in consistent terms across many accounts of frontier life. The body pressed down into the softness. The material rose up on either side, and within a few minutes, the air immediately surrounding the sleeper was noticeably warmer than it had been when they first lay down. This warming was entirely generated by the body's own heat, trapped by the down and held in place. No external heat source was required to maintain it. The feather bed was as close to a self-contained thermal system as the frontier. Bedroom possessed. Over the sleepers went the quilts. A frontier quilt was made from 3 layers, a decorative upper surface, a middle layer of batting, and a plain backing. The batting was the insulating core. Wool flannel carded into a loose, lofty mass, or raw cotton processed to a similar consistency. Wool was preferred in the coldest regions and the coldest months because it retained its insulating quality, even when damp, a property that cotton lacked. A wool batting that had absorbed moisture from a sleeper's perspiration continued to trap air and hold warmth. Cotton batting in the same condition provided significantly less protection. The outer fabric of the quilt was assembled from whatever textile scraps the household had accumulated. Worn-out garments, shirts, dresses, trousers past repair, were cut into pieces and sewn together in patterns that made efficient use of irregular shapes. Salt sacks and flour bags, once washed, provided a plain, durable fabric that held dye and stitching well. Neckties contributed their narrow shapes to geometric patterns. The result was a textile that carried the visual history of the family in its surface, the blue of a child's worn dress beside the coarse weave of a work shirt, the fine cotton of a special occasion garment beside the rough texture of a feed sack. Quilts were not made individually. The assembly of a quilt top, the process of cutting and sewing dozens or hundreds of small fabric pieces into a coherent pattern, was often done by a single woman over many evenings of winter work. But the quilting itself, which required holding the 3 layers together with tiny, even stitches passed through all of them at once, was a collective task. Quilting bees brought women together for a full day or afternoon of shared labor. Several pairs of hands working simultaneously around the quilting frame reduced to hours what would have taken weeks alone. The completed quilt was the combined work of the household and its community in the most literal sense. On the coldest nights, additional quilts were pulled from storage, folded in a chest or laid over a chair near the hearth where they had been warming, and added to the pile on the bed. The weight of multiple quilts pressing down on the sleeper was itself a form of warmth. The compression limited the air gaps through which body heat could escape, and the accumulated mass of fabric provided a thermal barrier that the single quilt bed of a mild night could not match. Families who had prepared well entered the coldest weeks of the year with enough quilts to sleep through them. Those who had not felt the difference before morning. A quilt made on the American frontier was rarely new in its materials. The fabrics that composed its surface had almost always served another purpose first. It was clothing worn through seasons of work and weather, as domestic textiles used until their original function was exhausted as packaging. Materials that had carried goods from distant places into the household's daily life. When a shirt became too worn to repair, it was not discarded. It was folded away, and in due course it was cut into pieces and incorporated into the next quilt the family made. This practice of textile recycling was born from necessity. Fabric on the frontier was expensive and scarce. It could not be produced at home without considerable equipment and labor. A spinning wheel, a loom, raw fiber, and the skill to process each stage from fleece or cotton boll to finished cloth. Most frontier families produced some of their own yarn and some of their own woven goods, but they also depended on purchased fabric for specific purposes, and purchased fabric cost money or trade goods that were always in limited supply. Wasting cloth, throwing away a worn garment rather than extracting its remaining usable pieces, was a form of waste that the frontier economy did not easily absorb. The quilt was the natural destination for textile remnants. Its construction method, assembling small pieces into a larger whole, was specifically suited to working with scraps of irregular size and varying condition. A piece of fabric too small to make a sleeve could still make a quilt block. A section of fabric too weakened by use at its center might still have sound material at its edges. The quilt pattern determined how these pieces were shaped and arranged, but the patterns themselves had largely evolved to accommodate the realities of working with found material, rather than fabric purchased specifically for the purpose. Among the most widespread patterns was the one called log cabin. In this design, a central square, traditionally cut from red fabric, sat at the heart of each block, representing the hearth fire at the center of domestic life. Around this center, strips of fabric were added in sequence, alternating between lighter and darker pieces on opposite sides. The resulting block had a visual contrast built into its structure. One half composed of lighter fabrics, representing the illuminated side of the cabin near the fire, and the other half of darker fabrics, representing the shadow. When multiple blocks were assembled into a finished quilt, and the arrangement was considered carefully, the light and dark halves could be oriented to create large-scale patterns across the surface. Diamonds, chevrons, interlocking shapes that emerged from the overall composition rather than from any single block. The 9-patch was perhaps the simplest of the common quilt patterns. 9 squares of fabric, alternating in color or value, sewn into a 3x3 grid. Its simplicity made it accessible to beginning quilters and to households where time was most scarce. A 9-patch could be assembled from the smallest scraps. Every piece of usable fabric could find a place in it, regardless of size. The pattern's visual modesty was part of its appeal. It made no demands that the fabric be anything other than what it was. The barn-raising arrangement of the log cabin block deserves its own attention. In this setting of the pattern, the blocks were rotated and assembled so that the light and dark halves created a series of concentric diamonds radiating outward from the center of the quilt. The visual effect was of expanding rings, moving from the center to the edges, a pattern that had both a geometric elegance and a symbolic resonance. The barn raising was one of the most significant communal events on the frontier, neighbors gathering to erect a structure that no single family could build alone. A quilt arranged in the barn-raising pattern carried this association in its name, and for those who had participated in such an event, in its form. What the quilt accumulated over time was not only fabric, but association. A piece cut from a child's first dress sat beside a strip from a husband's work coat. A square of the fabric from a wedding, Garment lay adjacent to a remnant of the cloth that had wrapped a newborn. These connections were known to the maker and to the family. They were not always visible to anyone else. The finished quilt surface did not announce its origins, but they were present, embedded in the material. The making of a quilt was therefore also the making of a record. Not a written record, not one that could be read by anyone outside the household, but a material one that preserved the trace of garments and people and seasons that might otherwise leave no mark. In a world where few frontier families kept diaries and where the material possessions of a lifetime were modest, the quilt was one of the few objects that accumulated meaning as it accumulated use. At the same time, it was a functional object used nightly through the winter months. It was pulled from the bed in the morning and folded. It was shaken out and aired when the weather allowed. It absorbed the warmth of the bodies beneath it, the smoke of the fire around it. Over years of this use, the fabrics that composed it aged together, fading, softening, wearing in the places most frequently handled. The quilt that began as an assembly of scraps became, over time, a unified textile, its varied origins less visible, its many pieces moving toward a single quality of use and age. When a quilt wore through entirely, when the batting had compacted and the surface fabrics thinned past the point of repair, it was often cut apart again. The still sound pieces were salvaged and incorporated into the next quilt. The cycle of textile life on the frontier had no clear endpoint. Material moved from one form to another, from garment to remnant, to quilt block, to patch to backing, until nothing remained that could serve any further purpose. The quilt was not the end of the fabric's life. It was one stage in a much longer passage. The private bedroom is a recent invention, measured against the full span of human domestic history. For most of the centuries during which people have lived and built structures, sleep was a shared arrangement, not from preference, but from the logic of warmth, space, and survival. On the 19th century American frontier, this logic was especially clear. A cabin of 400 square feet housed a family of 5, 6, 8, or more, and through the winter months, that space contracted further as the cold outside pressed every living thing toward the warmth at its center. In the typical single-room frontier cabin, the parents occupied the main bed on the ground floor. This bed was positioned, as described in earlier chapters, at a considered distance from the hearth, close enough to benefit from its overnight warmth, far enough to remain stable in temperature as the fire subsided. A simple curtain, hung from a cord or a wooden rod, sometimes divided the bed from the rest of the room. This partition offered a degree of visual privacy during the waking hours, but it did nothing to separate the thermal environment of the bed from the room around it. The air was shared, the warmth was shared. The children climbed to the loft. Most frontier cabins of any permanence included a sleeping loft reached by a simple ladder, sometimes little more than notched rungs nailed to the wall, sometimes a more formal set of steps steep enough to require a handhold at the top. The loft was a low space, often not tall enough for an adult to stand upright, floored with rough boards and insulated above by the roof itself. Its primary thermal advantage was elevation. Heat rises, and the air in the upper portion of a room is measurably warmer than the air at floor level. The loft collected the warmth that the hearth produced and held it near the ceiling, where the children slept. In the coldest weeks, the differential between the floor-level air and the loft air could be significant. A family that had kept a fire through a long winter night might find on the coldest mornings that the air near the floor was noticeably harsher than the air above. The children in the loft, wrapped in their own quilts and sleeping in a space that was both elevated and enclosed on three sides by the roof, were often the warmest members of the household through the night. When travelers or itinerant workers sought shelter at a frontier cabin, a traveling preacher on a circuit, a laborer moving between settlements, a neighbor whose own situation had become untenable for the night, they were absorbed into this sleeping arrangement without ceremony. The hospitality of the frontier cabin was not selective. Space was made where it could be made. Another body on the floor near the hearth, a place in the loft beside the children, a share of the quilts. The additional body added to the room's aggregate warmth and the cost of feeding one more person through a single night was manageable. This proximity, the sharing of breath and warmth and the sounds of sleep, required a particular social accommodation. A family that spent 6 months of the year in close quarters developed a fluency in one another's presence that is difficult to recover in imagination. Everyone knew the sound of each other's breathing and sleep. Everyone knew who turned often and who lay still, who woke early and who slept heavily. These were not observations made consciously. They were simply absorbed, as the body absorbs the temperature of the room, gradually without effort, until they became the baseline of normal. The preparation for sleep reflected this shared context. The last tasks of the evening were completed in a sequence understood by everyone in the household. The father checked the door latch, pressing it firmly to confirm that no gap had opened that the wind could find. The mother might place an extra quilt near the hearth, not on the bed, but within reach, available if the night proved colder than expected. The older children helped the younger ones to the loft. Stockings were kept on. Multiple layers of wool clothing remained on the body, their accumulated warmth preserved from the day and carried into the night. The logic of keeping clothing on through the night was straightforward. The body generates heat continuously, and that heat warms whatever is in direct contact with the skin. A layer of wool worn against the body for the full day had absorbed that warmth and reached an equilibrium with it. Removing the wool at bedtime meant releasing that stored warmth into the cold air of the cabin. Putting on cold wool in the morning meant asking the body to spend energy warming the fabric before the warmth could be returned. Keeping the clothing on through the night avoided both losses. Boots and heavier outer garments were removed, but these were placed near the hearth rather than left in the cold. Leather that freezes overnight contracts and stiffens, and returning to frozen boots in the morning was a small but real hardship on a day that demanded immediate outdoor work. The habit of placing boots at the hearth's edge before sleeping was a preparation for the morning as much as a courtesy to the leather. When the loft ladder had been climbed and the last candle extinguished, the cabin settled into its overnight state. The fire breathed behind its banked ash. The logs held their accumulated warmth. The bodies in the bed and the loft contributed their heat to the air of the room, each person a small but persistent source of warmth that the space absorbed and retained. The collective thermal mass of a family sleeping together in a well-built cabin was not trivial. It was a measurable contribution to the survival of the night. When the last candle was extinguished and the cabin settled into its overnight dark, what remained was not complete blackness. The banked fire gave off a low, steady glow from behind the stove's air. Vents or through the gaps in a closed hearth damper, a dim orange light that moved slightly as the coals shifted, casting soft, irregular shadows on the nearest wall. It was enough light to see the shapes of the room without being enough to read by or work by. It was the light of a space at rest. The cabin's windows contributed nothing to this illumination after dark. Most frontier windows were not glazed. Glass was expensive, fragile in transit, and not always available in the more remote settlements. In its place, settlers used materials that admitted some light during the day while blocking the wind. Greased paper, stretched and tacked across the window frame, became translucent when treated with lard or tallow and allowed a diffuse, muted daylight into the room. Scraped animal membrane, rawhide dried thin enough to be semi-transparent, served the same purpose in some households. Neither material admitted meaningful light after dark. The windows at night were simply opaque, surfaces that held the cold at a slight remove. What the eye found in the dim interior was the ceiling, or rather the underside of the roof, the rafters and the boards above them, the surface that one lay looking up at from the bed. This surface was not the raw, pale wood of fresh construction. In a cabin that had been lived in through multiple winters, it was darkened. Smoke from the hearth and the stove did not vent perfectly and completely. Some fraction of it dispersed into the room before finding the chimney, and over months and years of fires, this smoke deposited a thin, continuous layer of carbon and residue across every horizontal surface it could reach. The rafters darkened first, then the boards between them, then gradually the walls above the height of regular occupation. Some settlers referred to the smoke-darkened ceiling as the sky of the house. The phrase captured something accurate about how that surface functioned in the imagination of the people who lay beneath it each night. It was the upper boundary of their enclosed world, the plane above which the cold and the wind existed, and below which everything that mattered to survival was contained. The darkening of its surface over years of fire was a record of those fires, a visual accumulation of every winter that had been endured within the walls. The smell of the cabin at night was inseparable from this smoke. Wood smoke from hardwood fires has a specific quality, not the sharp, acrid smell of fresh combustion, but the softer, settled smell that clings to surfaces after the fire has been burning for hours. Combined with the smell of tallow from spent candles, the animal fats used in cooking and lamp oil, the wool of the quilts and clothing, and the particular earthiness of dried herbs and stored food, the cabin's night smell was dense and specific. It was the smell of warmth, not warmth as an abstract comfort, but warmth as a physical fact maintained by combustion, by animal, metabolism by the thermal properties of fabric and wood and ash. The light from tallow candles when they were used was yellow and soft. Tallow rendered animal fat, typically from cattle or sheep, burned at a lower temperature than beeswax and produced a slightly smokier, less stable flame. A tallow candle in still air burned steadily enough, but the slightest draft set it wavering. In a cabin where the air moved with every opening of the door and every shift of the fire's draft, candle flames were in near constant motion. This flickering was the visual texture of the interior evening, shadows that moved on the walls as the flame bent, objects that appeared and disappeared at the edges of the light's reach, the family's faces alternately illuminated and obscured as they moved through the space. Betty lamps, small iron or tin dishes that held a wick suspended in a pool of grease or fat, provided a cruder but more economical light source than candles. The flame of a Betty lamp was lower and less stable than a candle, and it produced more smoke. Positioned on a shelf or hung from a hook above the working area, it cast enough light for spinning, sewing, or reading, though the quality of that light required the worker to stay close and attentive. Betty lamps were used sparingly, like all sources of illumination, because the fat they consumed was a resource with multiple competing uses. In the hours before sleep, this dim and moving light shaped how the family occupied the space. Work that required precision, fine sewing, the reading of a letter, was done close to the light source. Conversation happened at a distance where faces were visible, but the surrounding room was in shadow. Children in the loft were above the light's reach entirely, in a darkness punctuated only by the faint warmth of the coals below. The visual world of the frontier evening was intimate and bounded, a circle of visibility centered on the fire, with everything else fading into the peripheral dark. This was not experienced as deprivation by those who had known no other condition. The dim, smoke-scented, fire-lit interior was simply the interior. The way the cabin looked and smelled and felt after dark, from the first autumn evening through to the last cold night of early spring. The smoke on the rafters was familiar. The orange glow behind the stove vent was familiar. The moving shadows were familiar. They were the sensory furniture of the winter night, as known and unremarkable as the sound of breathing from the next bed. Inside the banked cabin, with the fire settled and the family in bed, the soundscape of the frontier night was a layered thing, some of it from within the walls, some of it from the world outside, and some of it from the structure itself, which was not entirely passive in its relationship with the cold. The stove or banked hearth produced its own quiet sounds through the night. The slow combustion of the overnight coals occasionally produced a faint hiss or a soft tick as a coal shifted or a piece of half-burned wood settled into the ash. The iron of the stove expanded as it warmed and contracted as the fire dropped, producing small, irregular metallic sounds. Pings and ticks that moved across the surface of the metal as the temperature changed. These sounds were so consistent a part of the night that they ceased to register consciously for anyone who had spent a winter with the same stove. They were simply part of the silence, The logs of the cabin walls contributed their own sounds as the night deepened and the temperature outside dropped further. Wood expands when warm and contracts when cold. A log that had been sealed into the wall and held its dimensions through the moderate temperatures of the day would begin to move as the exterior cold intensified after midnight, the coldest hours of most winter nights. This movement was not large, but it was audible, a sharp crack followed by silence, then another from a different part of the wall. The logs were adjusting to the cold, and the sound of that adjustment was a percussive thread running through the quieter hours of the early morning. Experienced settlers recognized these sounds without waking fully to them. A cracking wall in deep cold meant the temperature outside was falling, a useful piece of information that registered somewhere below full consciousness, noted and filed without requiring a response. A family that had spent several winters in the same cabin had learned its specific vocabulary of sounds. Which crack came from the north wall when the temperature dropped below a certain point? Which part of the roof settled under accumulated snow? Which door latch rattled in a particular direction of wind? This knowledge was not deliberate. It was absorbed through repetition. The roof was the most variable source of interior sound. Snow accumulating on a flat or shallow-pitched roof added weight that the structure bore quietly until a temperature shift caused some of it to slide. A sudden rushing sound followed by the muffled impact of snow reaching the ground below. Ice forming in the gaps of imperfectly sealed roofing boards produced its own slow creaking pressure. On the coldest nights, the entire roof could produce a sustained low groaning as the cold worked into its structure from above, while the warmer air of the cabin interior pressed against it from below. Outside the walls, the winter night had its own distinct sound. The most reliable constant was wind, not the dramatic howl of a storm, which was its own separate phenomenon, but the ordinary sustained movement of cold air across the cleared land around the cabin. Wind in leafless trees produced a dry, rattling sound, the fine branches clicking against each other without the softening effect that summer foliage would have provided. In the open land of a cleared farm, the wind moved across the snow surface with a continuous low hiss that could be heard clearly when the cabin was otherwise quiet. Animals contributed to the soundscape in predictable ways. The barn, if it stood nearby, occasionally carried the sounds of the livestock, a horse shifting weight, the settling sound of cattle in their stalls, the more vocal complaints of goats or pigs in the coldest hours. These sounds were reassuring to the family inside the cabin, in the same way that the cracking of the logs was reassuring. They confirmed that the animals were alive and that the barn was holding its temperature well enough to keep them so. The wildlife of the winter woods produced sounds of a different character. The great horned owl was among the most reliably audible, its deep, resonant call carrying through the cold air across considerable distances. The fox was another. Its mating call in the deep winter months has a quality that settlers described in striking terms, comparing it to a human voice raised in distress. Heard for the first time, from inside a dark cabin, the sound of a fox calling at close range was startling. Heard through many winters, it became simply another marker of the season, evidence that the natural world continued its cycles outside the cabin walls, indifferent to the cold that was pressing so hard against everything within. On still nights near frozen water, the ice produced sounds of its own. As the temperature dropped and the ice on a lake or creek thickened and contracted, it cracked, sometimes with a sound like a rifle shot, sometimes with a lower, more sustained groan that moved across the surface and faded into the distance. This cracking did not indicate that the ice was breaking. It was the sound of the ice strengthening, of the freeze deepening. Settlers who knew this understood it as one of the night's more reliable indicators. When the lake cracked loudly, the cold was serious. Taken together, these sounds formed a continuous low-level audit of the night, a stream of information about temperature, weather, and the condition of the cabin and its surroundings that the sleeping family absorbed passively. To sleep in a frontier cabin in deep winter was to remain, even in sleep, in a loose connection with the state of the world outside the walls. The sounds that were familiar were reassuring. The sounds that were unfamiliar, a sharp impact on the roof, a prolonged groaning of timber, the absence of the barn sounds that usually mark the early morning, were the ones that brought a person fully awake, moving toward the fire in the door, to understand what had changed. When the meal was finished and the warm drinks had been prepared and the spinning wheel had been set turning, the long frontier evening still had hours ahead of it. Darkness fell early in the winter months, by 4 or 5 in the afternoon in the deepest weeks of the season, and it was not until 8 or 9 that the family would move towards sleep. Those intervening hours were not filled with silence. They were filled with talk. Storytelling on the frontier was not a performance reserved for special occasions. It was a daily practice, as embedded in the rhythm of the winter evening as the preparation of food or the tending of the fire. In households where books were scarce and newspapers arrived infrequently and irregularly, the spoken word carried the full weight of entertainment, education, community memory, and cultural transmission. The stories told by firelight in a frontier cabin were doing work that print culture does for us invisibly. They were passing values from one generation to the next, explaining the shape of the world and providing a shared framework of meaning for the people sitting together in the dim room. The Appalachian region, in particular, maintained a tradition of oral storytelling that drew on multiple cultural streams. The English and Scots-Irish immigrant traditions of the 18th century, the indigenous knowledge and narrative forms of the peoples who had inhabited the land before, and the experiences of the frontier itself, which generated its own stories almost as fast as they could be told. This tradition did not distinguish sharply between the factual and the fantastical. A story about a neighbor's encounter with a bear on the ridge above the settlement, and a story about a spirit returning to set right a wrong done in life, were told in the same voice, from the same seat by the fire, to the same audience. Ghost stories were common and took form specific to the Appalachian tradition. The spirits in these stories were not usually malevolent. They were purposeful, returning to complete something left unfinished, to protect someone in danger, to expose an injustice that had not been addressed through ordinary means. The Greenbrier ghost, which circulated in the oral tradition of Western Virginia in the late 18th century, was one of the most widely known. A woman, whose apparition, according to the account, provided information that led to the criminal conviction of her murderer. Whether the account was believed literally or understood as a particular kind of moral story mattered less than the function it served, articulating in the form of a narrative a community's sense of what justice required and what happened when it was denied. Other stories were less solemn. The frontier produced a rich tradition of comic narrative, tales of improvised solutions to impossible situations, of clever children outwitting adults, of the comic gap between a settler's ambitions and the land's indifference to them. These stories required a performer as much as a storyteller. The timing of a pause, the shift in voice between characters, the controlled release of tension toward an ending that the audience had been moving toward for several minutes. The skill of the teller shaped the experience as much as the content of the tale itself. For the children in the loft, the stories drifting up from below formed a particular kind of nighttime accompaniment. They could hear, without seeing, the voices of the adults below, the occasional laughter or the held quiet of a tense moment in the narrative, the creak of the spinning wheel resuming after a pause. The stories provided a framework for the sounds of the winter outside, the wind against the walls, the cracking of the logs, the calls of the owl. A child who had heard enough stories about the winter woods had a way of interpreting those sounds. Not necessarily a comforting interpretation, but an organized one. The night was a place in which things happened, and the stories gave those things shape. Women's work and storytelling were inseparable through the winter evenings. The great wheel, the walking wheel used to spin raw wool into yarn, was in near constant use during the cold months. The spinner walked back and forth beside the wheel, drafting the fiber with one hand and turning the wheel with the other, covering several miles of movement in the course of an evening's work without leaving the room. This repetitive ambulatory task left the mind free and the mouth available. The rhythm of the wheel became the rhythm of the storytelling, a background hum against which the words moved, The social fabric of the isolated frontier settlement was maintained in part through these evening hours. Stories carried news from one household to another. The condition of a neighbor's crops, the progress of a new road, the outcome of a dispute. Embedded in narratives that made the information memorable and gave it context. The gossip and the ghost story were not entirely different categories. Both were forms of community communication, moving through the network of households in the spoken word rather than on paper. As the evening wound toward its close, the stories became quieter. The comic tales gave way to the more reflective ones. The children in the loft had grown still. The spinning wheel turned more slowly. The fire had dropped to its overnight level. The kinds of stories told in the last hour of the evening were often the oldest ones, the ones that moved slowly, that did not require close attention to follow, that carried their meaning in a familiar shape rather than a surprising one. These were the stories that had been told by the previous generation and the generation before that. They were worn smooth by repetition, and their familiarity was their virtue. They settled the mind rather than arousing it. They were the audible equivalent of the banked fire, reduced to their essential warmth, giving off just enough light to hold the dark at the edges of the room. At some point in the late evening, the stories stopped. The spinning wheel went still. The last of the warm drink was finished, and the cup was set down. The children had been asleep for some time already, their breathing audible from the loft in the quiet that followed the end of conversation. The fire had been banked. The door latch had been checked. The extra quilt had been moved within reach. What remained was sleep. To lie down in a frontier cabin in the deep of winter was to enter into a specific kind of reliance. The warmth of the room, at that moment, represented the combined effect of everything that had been done through the day and the season. The logs notched and fitted during the summer, the chinks packed and daubed in the autumn, the wood cut and stacked in the months before, the coals banked an hour ago, the quilts layered that morning, the food eaten at the evening meal. None of these things stood alone. Each was part of a system that only functioned because all its parts were in place. The family sleeping in the cabin was not passive within this system. They were its maintenance, their daily labor through every season. The wood gathering, the chinking repairs, the root cellar stocking, the quilt making, the animal tending, was what kept the system in its working state. But sleep was not a suspension of that labor. It was its purpose. The work of the day existed to make the night survivable, and in surviving the night, the family preserved the capacity for the next day's work. This circularity was the rhythm of frontier life in its most fundamental form, not a cycle of comfort and hardship, not a story of struggle and reward, but a continuous loop of preparation and rest, each feeding the other in a sequence that had no clear beginning and no end in sight. The winter did not conclude the cycle. It was one long passage within it, the season that pressed hardest on the system and demanded most from every component, but not a departure from the rhythm so much as its fullest expression. The cold that existed outside the cabin walls on the deepest nights of January was severe by any standard. Temperatures on the American frontier in the early 19th century could drop to levels that caused frostbite. Within minutes of exposure, that froze water in a bucket left by the door, that made the air feel like a physical force pressing against the face and hands. This cold was not abstract. It was the specific, immediate condition against which the entire system of the cabin, its walls, its fire, its bed, its food stores, was arrayed. And yet the family slept. They slept because the logs held. They slept because the ash over the coals preserved a living ember through the dark hours. They slept because the feather ticks surrounded them, and the quilts pressed down from above and their own bodies generated warmth that the layers held in place. They slept because the loft above them held the children in the warmest air of the room, and because their own breath, slowly exchanged with the air of the sealed cabin, raised its temperature by a small but consistent amount. The sleep was not comfortable by later standards. It was hard, early, deep, and heavily clothed, but it was sleep, and it sustained. Trust is perhaps too deliberate a word for what the sleeping family placed in the structures around them. They did not think about the thermal mass of the walls as they closed their eyes. They did not calculate the duration of the banked coal. These things had simply been tended as they were tended every night, and the tending was sufficient. What the sleep required was not conscious confidence in the system. It was the absence of a reason to doubt it, built up through seasons of maintaining what needed to be maintained, of replacing what had failed, of learning by experience which elements of the system could not be neglected and which had margins for error. The frontier cabin, viewed from this angle, was not primarily a physical object. It was an accumulated practice. The logs and the chinking and the stove and the quilts and the root cellar were the material form that the practice had taken. But the practice itself, the daily, seasonal, generational repetition of specific actions in a specific sequence, was what made the material form work. A cabin identical in its construction to one occupied by an experienced frontier family, placed in the hands of people who did not know how to bank the fire or season the wood or pack the chinks or layer the bed, would not have held. The knowledge was as much a part of the shelter as the timber. This knowledge was not written in books available at the time. It was carried in hands and in memory, passed from parents to children in the course of ordinary life, refined by each generation's particular winters and particular failures. The cold decade of 1810 to 1819 tested it more severely than most periods, but the knowledge held as the cabins held, and the families who possessed it carried it forward into the winters that followed. Outside the cabin, the winter night continued. The ice cracked on the lake. The owl called from the ridge above the cleared land. The wind moved across the snow in the field. The coals in the stove breathed slowly behind their covering of ash. The logs in the walls held their warmth and released it, degree by degree, into the sleeping room. And in the bed, under the quilts, the family rested. Each breath a small addition to the warmth of the air. Each body a small furnace sustaining the microclimate that the season could not reach. The night passed, as it always had. Morning came, as it always did. The seed fire, uncovered from its ash, caught the new kindling and held.